Hello and welcome to Hello Mormonism, where we place Mormonism's claims and compare them to historic Christianity. Now, we assume they are not the same, but there is considerable overlap. And the reason that we assume that they're not the same is that Mormonism's first claim is that the gospel needed restoring, that it had been lost, and that in 1820, all denominations were considered an abomination. In these episodes, the Book of Mormon Musical is our way into talking about Mormon claims. And we've reached the part in the show where the missionaries are no longer in the protected bubble of their training center environment, but they're actually in the field and they're talking to real people in Uganda. And there's a strange thing about this song, which is called All American Prophet, because for 6 minutes, it manages to make Mormonism feel tidy and familiar and almost obvious. And the reason that that is odd is because most non-Mormons, like myself, when we experience Mormonism, it's often the opposite of tidy. Perhaps there's too many angels or too many visions, maybe too many extra books. And if we're honest, sometimes it can feel like that there's too many claims that all arrive at once. And yet this song somehow makes it feel simple and tidy, even though the Ugandans are confused by the end. And I think that has a measure of importance because young missionaries often have confidence, but we have to ask the question, do they speak in language that the average person outside the system actually understands? So I want to start here, not because you should build your theology from a stage show. I mean, that seems pretty obviously a bad idea, but because this song is doing something clear. It's telling us what kind of story Mormonism thinks it is. And if we misread that story, then we misunderstand the missionaries, we misread their tone, and then we don't know really what's being asked of us as hearers. Now, if you've watched earlier episodes of Hello Mormonism, especially the ones where I've looked at missionary life as sort of lived experience, where we look at the pressure and the managed week and the performance of cheerfulness, you'll know I'm not starting from scratch here. And you know that I believe that it is important that we begin with some humanity before we move to theology. And so we've already talked about the gap between church teaching on paper and perhaps the cultural pressure that there is for real life Mormon missionaries. We've already looked at how the system forms a certain kind of presence, and then why in the musical the joke "turn it off" lands and is funny, because we recognize it. It's a recognizable trait. So this episode and the future episodes going forward isn't me changing direction. It's me sort of on the same path, but looking at things from a different perspective. But also the idea that we must consider these people as humans, but they're arriving with theological claims. The missionaries want to convert you. So we have to ask, what do we want to achieve as believers in historic Christianity? Because when missionaries meet you or you meet them, it's about dialogue. It's a conversation. There's two different theologies and two different worldviews. But we have to do all of this without forgetting that everyone involved in the conversation is a human being. They are a real person. So there's kind of two ways, really, that you can meet Mormonism, I suppose, unless you live next to a Mormon. You know, either it's a knock on the door, or it is something in cultural society like the musical. When the Mormons knocking on the door can feel polite and earnest, but perhaps slightly awkward, whereas the musical, can feel loud and cheeky and irreverent. But I think here's something that's worth considering, because they are often telling the same story, but at very different speeds. I think it probably took me longer than it should have done to realize that, because it's easy to assume that parody and real life have nothing to do with each other. But parody, like in the musical, seems to work best when you can recognize it. And perhaps that's why, although it often feels uncomfortable, but there is something that is comfortable in watching this musical. So All American Prophet compresses the founding story of Mormonism into a really oversimplified arc. It begins with revelation, moves to opposition, which becomes persecution, and then there's a death, and then the mission goes round in this cycle again. And I think it's important to be careful about this, because the arc was not invented by Broadway. It's actually already there in sort of Mormon self-understanding, and especially in how they tell people like you and me, the outsiders, this story. So my first claim today is not that this song is accurate. My first claim is that this song is confident because Mormonism itself is confident. It doesn't present itself as like a theory, but it presents itself as an actual event and real history. So the title of the song, All American Prophet, that phrase doesn't just locate Joseph Smith sort of geographically. It tells you how we're meant to feel about him, because All American means wholesome and sincere and clean-cut and well-meaning, perhaps slightly naive, but ultimately trustworthy and even familiar, because Mormonism has always had to answer this sort of unasked, quiet question that why did God choose a prophet to restore the gospel from 19th century America? And this song, much like Mormon missionaries themselves, don't argue it. It just accepts it and carries on. And that acceptance, I think, is doing a lot of the work and is quite a fair representation of how Mormon missionaries present the gospel. Because once the prophet Joseph Smith feels familiar, the rest of the story becomes plausible. And that actually is one of the key strategies of LDS missionaries. They arrive with this personal testimony and they demonstrate that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God from their perspective. And then following from all of that, they want to convince you and you to have a testimony that is the same. And then we have to accept all his claims, or at least they need to be taken very seriously. Now, the song itself in the musical doesn't make vague claims. It sings really bold things. Joseph Smith spoke to God. Angels appear. A new book is revealed and people get angry, and then the prophet dies, and then it sort of cuts and it cuts to the next scene. And I think if you've ever spoken to missionaries, then perhaps we'll recognize the pace, not because they're trying to rush us necessarily, but because the story is designed to move forward, to keep being revealed, to build on the next step, because it's not built to sit and brood on questions. That's the kind of thing they're going to leave you with when they've gone for you to think about. But it's built from the missionary perspective on an invitation to respond. And I just want to be clear, I'm not saying that as an insult. I hope I'm describing the pattern. Maybe it's because Mormon missionaries are used to having to get all the information out immediately and then move on because they only have one conversation, and maybe they believe there's only one chance to get all of this out. So if you're not Mormon, then the song itself can feel like it says everything. Also, maybe nothing at once. There's so many claims and so little explanation. But I don't think the confusion is just the song's fault. We're dealing with multiple visions, angels with names that don't feel familiar, that gold plates that no one else sees, and witnesses who testify, but in ways that modern people don't perhaps instinctively understand. And to outsiders, it can feel like too much information and not enough clarity and justification. I remember hearing the story as a much younger man and thinking, right, but what bit am I meant to absorb and believe first? And I think that question actually turns out to be an important one, because here's what the song assumes without ever stating it, that the story doesn't begin with doctrine. You believe doctrine once you believe the claims about Joseph Smith. So it begins with authority, that Joseph Smith spoke to God, and therefore everything that follows matters. And notice how disbelief is framed, that people call him a liar and they get angry, and opposition is always or often coded as hostility. And that is a very old religious instinct, because if revelation comes first, then doubt isn't just intellectual, it starts to feel moral and theological. And that's why the story moves so quickly from revelation and the talking to God and the angel and the books to persecution and martyrdom. So near the end, Joseph Smith is killed by an angry mob. There's no context, there's no slow history, there's just violence and loss, and then sacred meaning found in the missionaries in this event. And martyrdom does something powerful. It doesn't only explain a death, it sort of sanctifies the whole story. That once a death is sacred, then criticism from the outside starts to sound more like cruelty. And I think we'll come back to that in a later episode properly. But for now, notice what's happening. The song isn't interested in details, it's interested in meaning, and it's meaning delivered at such a great pace. So let me tell you what the plan is of these episodes and what is coming next, because this isn't a one-off, this is an introduction to the next series. But I also don't want viewers thinking that this series is going to be me doing, that usual YouTube internet thing where I just toss out all the mega 5 gotchas and then call it a day and then wash my hands of this and say, job done. That, if you've watched me before, I think that's not my style, and that's not ever really what I plan to do. So in the next episode, I think there's 5 or 6 more episodes relating to this song wheel. But in the next episode, we will take one line from this song, the line, "He spoke to God," the Mormon prophet spoke to God, and we'll slow it right down. We'll read the 4 first vision accounts side by side, and we'll use the church's own official explanation as to why these multiple accounts exist. We won't be hostile, we'll be careful, we'll act because I'll be a historian, and we'll look at those claims, and then we'll look at what the latest parts they've said about that in their sort of newer history books. And after that, we move to Moroni, where we'll look at the angel story and we'll cover the plates. And we won't look at Moroni as this statue on top of a temple, but as an authority claim. And we'll use official church material again on the Book of Mormon translation and how the story is told. We'll look at some old documents, and then we'll do the 3 and 8 witnesses. We'll do the witness statements properly, the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, and we'll look at exactly what they say and what kind of witness they think they're giving, and also why that matters. And then we'll move to Moroni chapter 10, the read and pray passage, and I'll walk it through line by line, because we'll see what the missionaries are trying to do, because really that is the conversation centerpiece. That is the method of trying to convert you. And it explains why, excuse me, and it explains why conversations with missionaries often feel like two people asking different questions. And then only after all that, we'll talk about persecution and martyrdom and why the story stays emotionally powerful, even for people who know all the controversies. So this episode is like the introduction, the doorway, if you will, and the map. And the next ones are where we're actually going to journey through it. And what I hope is that we gain the tools to speak to Mormons with better understanding of them as people and their claims, but also the church's broader claims. So yes, we start with a musical number, as we always tend to on Hello Mormonism, because it shows us the shape of the story. And we do that before we argue and discuss the truth of the whole of Mormon sort of story and claims. The musical shows us what's assumed and what's rushed and what's central and what's treated as already settled. And I think if we don't notice those assumptions, then that's when we begin to misread the missionaries when they appear at our door. We'll think that maybe we're just having a religious chat when actually we're being invited into a whole alternative map of Christian history. So that's the beginning. This series isn't about proving Mormonism is ridiculous. It's about understanding what it actually claims. But once we understand the story being told, we can finally then ask the right questions about it. And that's where things, I think, get genuinely interesting. If you haven't watched the previous episode of Hello Mormonism, the one, I think it's called Hello Mormonism, the pressure you don't see or the pressure you can't see, then the link should be on screen now. I'd encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, as starting next Monday, for the next 5 or so weeks, we'll be looking at claims of Mormonism and the claims of the missionaries that knock on our door. God bless.